Conor, we had the ITIC conference last month, and you were on stage. You presented some really interesting research into tourism employees' performance, and you covered the areas of IQ, EQ, and MQ. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, just to go into it a little bit on, it's a theory that I've been working with for a good number of years. And it's pretty straightforward in terms of what it represents. It essentially asserts that if in an organization, on an individual and a collective basis, people have good scores in IQ, with essentially intellectual quotient, good scores in EQ, emotional quotient, and good scores on MQ, meaning quotient, that organization is more than likely to perform. But what that actually means is, you can delve into a little bit more detail, is IQ isn't just like how smart you are. That's the conventional view on it. In a workplace setting, and in order of performance, there's two dimensions in terms of IQ. One being people know the job that they've been retained to do and asked to do, their job spec. And that might sound like so basic and so fundamental, but oftentimes you're surprised that one of the issues with performance is people are not entirely or 100% sure about the jobs asked to do. And they go, I didn't know I was accountable for that. So that's one dimension of IQ. The second part of IQ is hugely important, I think, for leaders and managers, is that the individuals feel and are appropriately resourced and supported. And that's like, fundamental resources, but also training and knowledge and understanding to do the job. So knowing your job and then being equipped and resourced to do the job drives the IQ. And the EQ is probably a little bit more well known in terms of emotional intelligence. But there's various ways you can think about it in an organization. But probably the best way to think about it is, for performance point of view, is that people can join the dots between what they do and how it impacts on others in the organization, how it impacts on the business itself, and critically how it impacts on the customer in the case of tourism visitor or guest. Okay. What's alongside as well is they can join the dots between what they do and others do. So there's a kind of awareness of where they fit in and others fit in within the system.
Yeah.
So that's your EQ score. And the last one, the MQ, which is probably a more recent kind of phenomenon, is the meaning quotient. And that means essentially that people find meaning in their work. They think it's worthwhile doing. Okay, so they're more inclined to get out of bed in the morning and go, okay, this is a good thing to do. I enjoy doing it. Not only do I enjoy doing it, but I think there's some meaning in it, either for me or for the people I interact with.
Yeah.
And when you get those things to converge.
Yeah, if you put those three together, and then you get what? You get good performance, you get satisfied employees.
Yeah, you get all those things. And it's a multiplier effect. Because if you can get those conditions across a team and then across an organization, then performance will really be elevated. Because it's like, if one person's performing really strongly, but someone else isn't, it's going to minimize the overall impact. But if you've got a team or a broader organization that is really firing on all those cylinders, you're going to have high performance.
Yeah. So that IQ plus EQ plus MQ equals performance, that formula, has that been around for a while? I know you said kind of MQ might be new to us. It was new to me, but is that formula kind of rooted in some sort of scientific basis? It all sounds right. Some of it maybe is a little bit intangible, but it all sounds like a very, very clear and clever way of working out whether employees are happy and whether they're functioning correctly. Has it been around for a while? Is there any sort of primary research on it?
It has been around for a while. I'm not sure that it's been conventionally framed as a kind of framework or formula. And I think the thing I would say, Owen, is that I can't remember his name, but a famous sort of statistician said that all models and formulas,
nobody can ever remember the name of famous statistician.
But he said that most formulas and most models are flawed, but a lot of them are very, very useful. And of course, if you looked at that IQ, EQ, MQ formula, you could start to say, okay, well, what about people's sense of belonging? Is that belong and meaning? So there's lots of things you could do, but it is around for well over a decade. It was actually the concept, I believe, of the IQ and EQ have been around for quite some time. But the concept of MQ, I think, was framed by McKinsey, if I'm not incorrect, because what they were finding in the work that they were doing was, in terms of being management consultants and supporting performance, is that they were big on process, big on kind of organizational design and structure and all these sorts of things. And they increasingly saw that intellectual intelligence was important, but they increasingly also saw that meaning in work was very, very important. And we all know the phenomenon of, nowadays, an organizational purpose. I mean, that's been talked about, in a lot of detail. There's a lot of metrics that say an organization that walks around with a sense of purpose, and you could argue a derivative of that is a meaning performed. That's well documented. So it's around for quite some time, but I'm not quite sure it's been framed in that way.
Yeah, no, it's certainly very interesting. And so to get to the research, you carried out a sample, a national sample in advance of the ITIC conference. You presented the findings on the day. Tell us a little bit about the findings, about nationally, and I suppose pulling out sort of the tourism and hospitality sector from within it.
Yeah, sure. So it's the first time we had done it. We put those measures into market, and there was a sample of a little over 1,000, which is the kind of gold standard for a nationally representative sample that's statistically robust and all the things that you'd want it to be. And in truth, we didn't know, you and I and ITIC and Genesis didn't know what we were going to get because it hadn't really been measured before. So then if you've only got a benchmark, you can only kind of take almost a kind of subjective view on what the score looks like. So the first thing to say is I personally was surprised by how high the scores were. Really, I didn't necessarily anticipate it. It would indicate that across the Irish workforce, the performance is in pretty good shape. But actually, if you think about our economy and our productivity and the quality of the workforce and our education and all those sorts of things, maybe it isn't so surprising.
Yeah. So the survey was a series of questions. And the answers or the way people responded to them determined, IQ, EQ, and MQ.
Yeah, their scores, and it's about their own estimation and perception of it. So it was just 4 key questions, 2 on IQ, 1 on EQ, and 1 on MQ, and I've really kind of gone through them already. It was a very direct question around about, do you know your job? It wasn't said like that. It was a little bit more detailed. There was a very direct question around, do you feel resourced? There was a very direct question around being able to join the dots, and a very direct question around about meaning. And they were all rated on a scale of 1 to 10.
Yeah, and I should say that there's more detail on this in a kind of a fairly comprehensive report you did for ITIC, which sits on the Genesis website and the ITIC website.
Yeah. So if people are motivated to delve into it, it's there. Yeah. So, I mean, the scores were interesting, and I think they were high. I mean, certainly on IQ, I think in both instances, the scores were above 8 in terms of knowing the job to be done and feeling adequately resourced. And then they fell away slightly, but not dramatically on EQ and MQ. But that's not necessarily surprising. Because one of the big things here that I guess we could have had the foresight to see it, but it came through and it was interesting. It was kind of things you go, of course, is that one of the big dynamics is age plays a major factor in this. And of course, I say it now, as people get older and get further into their careers, the scores improve. But of course they would. You're more mature. You're still walking around in the latter half of your career not knowing what your job is. It's kind of problematic. If you're young or you're part-time or you're a student, you mightn't be there. And also, on EQ, you've got to believe that as people grow older, they mature and their emotional intelligence improves. So that's not surprising. But I think it was particularly heartening to see that the MQ improved with age, and right up to 65 plus. So it was very encouraging that people, and I guess there's a cohort of people, a significant cohort of people say, look, I'm not going to do something at this stage of my life I don't believe in or I find no meaning in, or do something else. So it moved through that. So that was very, very interesting. 2 other little things that were quite interesting were there wasn't a massive disparity when we looked at public versus private workers and those in employment there. Marginal, differences slightly in that private sector, not surprisingly, felt a little bit more equipped. So their IQ2 score was higher. But I think positively, public sector workers scored higher on the MQ, the meaning. And if you think that public sector requires teachers, doctors, nurses, civil servants, social workers, and their work that's orientated towards societal good. So again, maybe no surprise, but maybe a positive that we could see the MQ is higher. The other piece just to say is on gender, there was no major differences at all. There was a marginal higher scoring for females than males, but nothing dramatic at
Little
all.
material, yeah.
And that's positive as well, because if we think of what the workplace is like and how it's experienced, perceived, we're obviously striving towards it having, true equality.
Yeah.
And at least on this measure, there's a level of equality within it.
Yeah, yeah. And then when we kind of pull out the sort of tourism contingent within that national sample and compare it, say, to the overall metrics, how did tourism perform? And maybe do a bit of a delve into tourism and hospitality employees.
Yeah, it performed well, is what I'd say. It performed well. It certainly stood up alongside, very marginal difference to national average on IQ. So interestingly, those, people who are employed in the tourism sector, they are relative to others, really clear on the job, or clear on the job they've been doing, and feel relatively well resourced. Some small fallaways in terms of EQ and MQ. And actually, as you do the analysis, that's no major surprise if we think about the potential composition of the workforce in terms of its profile and age. And we also know that there's people who are part-time or early career, within the sector. So if you take that and correlate with the kind of age profile of how scores improve, that's no major surprise as well.
Yeah.
And also, look, we have to be honest as well. I mean, there's some, better than I, there's some fantastic roles and careers and opportunities. But like every industry, there are some perfunctory kind of functional roles as well. So sometimes it's hard, to really kind of say, can we get, maybe there's a ceiling for meaning score, because also, not just within tourism, there are people who, really they don't live to work, they work to live, and they don't necessarily seek the meaning of that. But overall, the scores were good. And I think the thing for tourism is that you've got to see it as strong scores, and maybe whether you see it as a half glass full or an opportunity.
Yeah.
There is opportunity to say, anything for anybody in the sector to say, well, how can I maybe do a bit of work with my people to help them to join the dots? What can I do in terms of emotional intelligence? Because
if you're a general manager or a CEO or a leader within industry, there's learnings here, aren't there, about how to sort of motivate your staff and how to give them more fulfillment?
Yeah, because for many, in my experience, and it's not universally true, when it comes to a management and a leadership level, and you talk about EQ, there's sometimes an assumption that it's kind of binary. Someone has it or not. So that person's in tune, or they're sensitive, or they're knowledgeable, or they're insightful. And then it becomes this kind of sense that it's really up to that individual to have EQ or not. But the truth of it is, EQ can absolutely be fostered.
Yeah.
So by giving talent and people insight into the customer and what they're experiencing, insight into relationships within an organization, insight into how what they do connects with the broader system, that all elevates their awareness. And that's the first bit around about emotional intelligence, having awareness. So I think there's a real opportunity, because you know better than I, but tourism is a team game. That's what it is. It's not people in isolation. It's a team game.
Yeah.
Experiences, hotels, transport, everything. It's a team game largely. And therefore, the way I kind of interpret it, it's a subjective view, is there's maybe an opportunity to really think in any given organization, how can I raise that EQ?
Yeah.
And the other thing in the MQ might be an opportunity as well. I mean, there's the impact of tourism is fantastic, not just for those who experience it, but we all know the community and societal benefits. We all know the experiential benefits. We all know the education and learning benefits are there to be had. So again, I think a broader view is, of course, every organization is different, but that does not mean that any and all organizations don't have the opportunity to take a moment as leaders and as managers and reflect. I might measure them, but what do I think how do I think my team would rate an IQ, EQ, and MQ? What can I do with them? How can I engage them to move it forward a wee bit? So it's less about the score, I think. For me, it's always been less about the score. It's about, well, what it might allow us to do to support and improve, and in a very kind of genuine, sincere, and authentic way. So it's a kind of win-win for organization and people.
Yeah. And now that we have this is the first time we've done this, or first time you've done this for the industry. Now that we have it, there's sort of a baseline there, or a benchmark there, isn't there? So we could repeat this in 12 months' time or 24 months' time and see whether scores have gone up or down. And that might tell us something as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's there. And benchmarks are hugely useful. And they become more and more useful over time because you get a trended analysis.
Yeah,
Um, and the bit here is that but the thing with benchmarks, as we all know, is they're a retrospective measure.
yeah,
They look in the rear view mirror.
yeah,
And I think the benchmarks only become really useful when you decide what are you going to do with that information in terms of what
yeah,
next. So if you aspire for the scores to go north in a sector level or at a company level, it's
yeah,
about what could we do to move the dial on it, you know?
yeah, yeah,
And I just want to say, I mean, I don't have deep awareness, but I observe the work of Falcha and others in the sector, and there's great work
yeah,
being done. I would say it's in no small part the work and the effort and the initiative and investment that's being put in that actually are driving those scores. It just doesn't just happen,
yeah.
There has to
Yeah.
be
Uh,
support and conditions for those type of
Absolutely.
things to occur.
Um, and you were also able to look at tourism compared to other sectors, weren't you? I know there was
Yes.
some interesting kind of relative scores, and maybe just
Yeah.
tell us maybe a couple of quick insights there.
Yeah, and it is relativity is important and interesting. I mean, everybody wants to know where they sit on the league table. Everyone wants to know where high performance lies and maybe not so. And I mean, I think unfortunately for financial services, including insurance, they rated lowest in terms of three of the four scores.
Right.
I think they're the only
And
one
why do you think that is, Connor?
I can
Because
only
one would say that they're possibly remunerated higher than something like tourism, but obviously, the IQ, EQ, and MQ doesn't necessarily talk about the financial package. But why would they score, if you like, poorly or relatively poorly?
I'd be very hesitant to offer a rationale because we didn't get to ask the question why. Okay.
Mm,
But I suspect that there is a couple of dynamics in play. Okay. I suspect that the changing nature of financial services, neo-banking, digital banking,
mm.
regulatory requirements
Yeah,
makes actually really knowing your job and being resourced somewhat difficult. You
yeah,
look at the implications of SEER, all those sorts of things, those regulatory factors, minimum competencies, all those sorts of things.
yeah,
It is quite, I suspect if I was in that sector, and I have done work in the sector, lots of work in the sector, it's not necessarily easy to be on point all the time. I think
yeah,
that there may be many people who feel a vulnerability because of the rate of change and the regulatory compliance demands within
yeah,
that as well.
yeah,
Okay, that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, I know it's more of a conventional view, but oftentimes, financial services as a sector, I think, has struggled to find meaning. Yeah. So I mean, the whole concept of banking is, revolves around the redistribution of wealth for societal good. But for many, it's about capitalism, profit. So I think there might be a cohort whereby it's about the EBITDA, the profit. And really, if you sit back and say, what did I do? What good did I do today? They might find it
yeah,
harder to understand that. But if you take someone in tourism who comes home and goes, I had some super interactions with some
yeah,
holidaymakers or guests, or I learned something new, or I brought these visitors somewhere, like you could come home and be quite energized and
yeah,
positive. So there may be constraints for that sector around about meaning, but I'm only speculating.
yeah.
But what
Of
I
course.
would say is, I would suspect in the financial service sector, it's very dependent on the organization. So I have insight into culture within different large scale banks and enterprises, and there is a difference. There can be a difference.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
the other things, some logical things came forward as well. Owen. I mean, in terms of being equipped and being able to join the dots, construction came forward really strongly.
yeah,
You think, oh my God, EQ in construction. But if you can't understand the system and you're building a house or an office, that's
yeah,
kind of problematic.
yeah,
So being
yeah,
able to know your job and do your job
yeah,
and be able to join the dots really, really important. And again, really positively on MQ, we see health and social services top score. We
yeah,
see education very closely behind it. So for people who are charged with people keeping healthy, educating people, they find tremendous amount
yeah.
of meaning
Well,
work, and that's as
yeah.
they should.
There's an element of vocation there, isn't there? So you'd expect
There
a
is, of
very high
course.
MQ.
Yeah, yeah. So it's great. It's great that that comes forward,
Yeah,
because then we didn't do the analysis. We could do it, but then what it says to me, and I'm not saying this isn't the case, but if people who have meaning to work in the health sector and the education sector, if we can, oh, not we, but as a society, if we can really support the degree to which they feel well-resourced, IQ2,
Yeah.
and in particular, because we know there's, the ongoing deficits within the health sector. But if you've got people who are well-resourced, who also find tremendous amount of meaning in the work, what progress and what transformation could we actually make within that sector? It has latent potential, is what I'd say.
No, it's really interesting, and I think to have a benchmark, I know it's a snapshot in time, but as you say, the benchmark is there for future years to compare against. And Genesis could do this exercise, for example, for a specific sector, for the transport sector or for the attraction sector, if you have the right sort of, mailing list effectively.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and then the only word of caution in doing any of that is just to have the scale. So to make it,
make it robust. Yeah.
But the other side of it as well is, there is a qualitative application of it as well. So even it doesn't have to involve Genesis or anybody else, but even if said manager, said leader is to enter into dialogue, they mightn't get a number out of it.
Yeah.
But they'll get understanding and they'll get insight, which is arguably even more important.
Yeah.
7.5 or 7.8. Okay.
Yeah.
But why is the number? Why do people feel the way they feel? And then the question has to become, what do we do about it?
Yeah.
Whether to harness it and maintain it because it's really good, or change it because there's an opportunity to improve it.
Yeah. Great, Conor, thank you so much. It was really fascinating research you presented at the ITIC conference. I know the delegates in the room, and there was over 400 delegates in the room. I know they found it very interesting. You were just before the lunch break, so you were very much the talk of the sandwich or the coffee. And it's really interesting research. The full report is up on the Genesis website. It's also up on the ITIC website. And thank you so much for your time.
Super. Thank you all.